Ignore the quill, Harry. Reluctantly, Harry looked up at her instead. Now, why did you decide to enter the tournament, Harry? I didn't, said Harry. I don't know how my name got into the Goblet of Fire. I didn't put it there. Rita Skeeter raised one heavily penciled eyebrow. Come on, Harry. There's no need to be scared of getting into trouble. We all know you shouldn't really have entered at all, but don't worry about that. Our readers love a rebel. I didn't enter, Harry repeated. I don't know who. How do you feel about the tasks ahead? Said Rita Skeeter. Excited? Nervous? I haven't really thought. Yeah, nervous, I suppose. His insides squirmed uncomfortably as he spoke. Champions have died in the past, haven't they? Said Rita Skeeter briskly. Have you thought about that at all? Well, they say it's going to be a lot safer this year, said Harry. The quill whizzed across the parchment between them, back and forth as though it were skating. Of course you've looked death in the face before, haven't you? Said Rita Skeeter, watching him closely. How would you say that's affected you? Said Harry yet again. Do you think that the trauma in your past might have made you keen to prove yourself, to live up to your name? Do you think that perhaps you attempted to enter the Triwizard tournament because I didn't enter, said Harry, starting to feel irritated. Can you remember your parents at all? Said Rita Skeeter, talking over him. No, said Harry. How do you think they'd feel if they knew you were competing in the Triwizard tournament? Proud? Worried? Angry? Harry was feeling really annoyed now. How on earth was he to know how his parents would feel if they were alive? He could feel Rita Skeeter watching him very intently, frowning. He avoided her gaze and looked down at words the quill had just written. Tears fill those startling green eyes as our conversation turns to the parents he can barely remember. I have not got tears in my eyes, said Harry loudly. Before Rita Skeeter could say another word, the door of the broom cupboard was pulled open. Harry looked around, blinking in the bright light. Albus Dumbledore stood there, looking down at both of them, squashed into the cupboard. Dumbledore! Cried Rita Skeeter, with every appearance of delight. But Harry noticed that her quill and the parchment had suddenly vanished from the box of magical mess remover, and Rita's clawed fingers were hastily snapping shut the clasp of her crocodile skin bag. How are you? She said, standing up and holding out one of her large, mannish hands to Dumbledore. I hope you saw my piece over the summer about the International Confederation of Wizards Conference. Enchantingly nasty, said Dumbledore. His eyes twinkling. I particularly enjoyed your description of me as an obsolete dingbat. Rita Skeeter didn't look remotely abashed. I was just making the point that some of your ideas are a little old-fashioned, Dumbledore, and that many wizards in the street. I would be delighted to hear the reasoning behind the rudeness, Rita, said Dumbledore, with a courteous bow and a smile. But I'm afraid we will have to discuss the matter later. The weighing of the wands is about to start, and it cannot take place if one of our champions is hidden in a broom cupboard. Very glad to get away from Rita Skeeter, Harry hurried back into the room. The other champions were now sitting in chairs near the door, and he sat down quickly next to Cedric, looking up at the velvet-covered table where 4 of the 5 judges were now sitting: Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxine, Mr. Crouch, and Ludo Bagman. Rita Skeeter settled herself down in a corner. Harry saw her slip the parchment out of her bag again, spread it on her knee, suck the end of the quick quotes quill, and place it once more on the parchment. "May I introduce Mr. Ollivander?" said Dumbledore, taking his place at the judges' table and talking to the champions. "He will be checking your wands to ensure that they are in good condition before the tournament." Harry looked around and with a jolt of surprise saw an old wizard with large pale eyes standing quietly by the window. Harry had met Mr. Ollivander before. He was the wand maker, from whom Harry had bought his own wand over 3 years ago in Diagon Alley. "Mademoiselle Delacour, could we have you first, please?" said Mr. Ollivander, stepping into the empty space in the middle of the room. Fleur Delacour swept over to Mr. Ollivander and handed him her wand. He said. He twirled the wand between his long fingers like a baton, and it emitted a number of pink and gold sparks. Then he held it close to his eyes and examined it carefully. "Yes," he said quietly, 9½ inches, inflexible, rosewood, and containing, dear me, an air from the aid of a villa," said Fleur. "One of my grandmothers." So Fleur was part villa, thought Harry, making a mental note to tell Ron. Then he remembered that Ron wasn't speaking to him. "Yes," said Mr. Ollivander, "yes. I've never used villa hair myself, of course. I find it makes for rather temperamental wands. However, to each his own, and if this suits you." Mr. Ollivander ran his fingers along the wand, apparently checking for scratches or bumps. Then he muttered, "Orchideus!" and a bunch of flowers burst from the wand tip. "Very well, very well. It's in fine working order," said Mr. Ollivander, scooping up the flowers and handing them to Fleur with her wand. "Mr. Diggory, you next." Fleur glided back to her seat, smiling at Cedric as he passed her. "Ah, now, this one of mine, isn't it?" said Mr. Ollivander with much more enthusiasm, as Cedric handed over his wand. "Yes, I remember it well. Containing a single hair from the tail of a particularly fine male unicorn. Must have been 17 hands. Nearly gored me with his horn after I plucked it. 12¼ inches. Ash. Pleasantly springy. It's in fine condition. You treat it regularly." "Polished it last night," said Cedric, grinning. Harry looked down at his own wand. He could see finger marks all over it. He gathered a fistful of robe from his knee and tried to rub it clean surreptitiously. Several gold sparks shot out of the end of it. Fleur Delacour gave him a very patronizing look, and he desisted. Mr. Ollivander sent a stream of silver smoke rings across the room from the tip of Cedric's wand, pronounced himself satisfied, and then said, "Mr. Crumb, if you please." Victor Crumb got up and slouched, round-shouldered and duck-footed, toward Mr. Ollivander. He thrust out his wand and stood scowling, with his hands in his pockets of his robes. Said Mr. Ollivander. "This is a Grigorievich creation, unless I'm mistaken. Fine wand maker. Thought the styling is never quite what However, he lifted the wand and examined it minutely, turning it over and over before his eyes. Yes, hornbeam and dragon heartstring. He shot at Crumb, who nodded. Okay. Yes, hornbeam and dragon string, he said to Crumb, who nodded. Rather thicker than one usually sees, quite rigid, 10 1/4 inches. Avis! The hornbeam wand let off a blast like a gun, and a number of small twittering birds flew out of the end and through the open window into the watery sunlight. Good, said Mr. Ollivander, handing Crumb back his wand. Which leaves Mr. Potter. And you will just have to hear what Mr. Ollivander has to say about Harry's wand next time.